Our first panel for the day is going to look at Built for All. And to help us with that, I want to bring on stage the Director for Innovation and Skill at Catholic Relief Services, no other person than Josh Harvey. Please show him some love as he takes. At this time, whilst he's coming, you should be waving at him. Just wave, keep waving, you know. Joining him on stage is a Deputy Head of Public Sector at Access Partnership. Help me bring on stage Alena Welch. Joining us on stage is the Vice President of Product and Programs at DataKind, Kathleen Augustine. Now, the last one, you don't need to clap this way. Do it well so that, they bring all their insight. Joining us for this panel discussion is the Director of AI Solutions Delivery at Data Science Nigeria. Help me bring on stage Chinozo Anebilundi. Do it to see on stage. Do it. Thank you. So, Josh, over to you. Right.
Yeah? Oh, there we go. Good morning, everyone. So, we're here to talk about a very serious topic, a lot of gravity, and that's trains. I know some of you are thinking, did he say trains? That's weird. The other half of you are thinking, at least it's not another AI panel. I'll take another one. So, trains. Let's start on trains. All right. I have family in the Czech Republic, and I teach in northern Italy, so I spend a lot of time in Europe over the course of a year. One of my absolute favorite things to do when I'm in Europe is ride the train. I love taking the train. And there's something remarkable to me about stepping off a plane and knowing that I can hop for little cost. I can move almost anywhere reliably, predictably, through systems that are connected to one another. I hop off the train. I know that in Prague I can hop on the tram. In Milan I can hop on the metro. I can hop on a bus system. I can hop on a bicycle system and get where I want to go as part of this broader ecosystem. Now, the designs differ, the operators differ, the experience differs. If you've ever been in Prague, you'll know the výstup, nástup language, right? The languages differ. But the underlying logic is shared. Common infrastructure that allows many services to connect and move together, right? So in many ways, that paradigm shift, that way of solving this problem of how do we move people and things around, is similar to the promise of digital public infrastructure. So DPI refers to our shared foundations such as identity systems, payment systems, data exchange, registries that allow governments, communities, and service providers to interact through interoperable and reusable infrastructure. So like these transit systems, DPI is less about a single application or platform. It's not about one train, one bus, one bicycle, but about the infrastructure beneath them, the tracks, the rails, if you will, upon which these services run. But this is only one way of solving this problem. So I'm from the US. The US confronted a similar problem in the 40s and 50s and pursued a profoundly different model. The interstate highway system in the US, connecting thousands, millions of paved miles of road, was an extraordinary public works project that standardized the way we move across the country. Enormous distances reshaped the way we use highways, reshaped our economy, our mobility, our daily lives. And yet, this infrastructure is never merely technical. That highway system carries with it and embeds assumptions and values. It privileges certain forms of mobility. It encourages individual rather than collective transit. In some cases, highways were built that deliberately disconnected minority communities from urban centers in the United States, or built a highway and overpass straight through a historically black community. These were intentional choices that were made. So a road may be a road, a path, but the ethos embedded within that infrastructure matters. And that is the deeper lesson that we want to explore today around DPI. Because when we talk about digital infrastructure, about interoperability, about scale, integration, efficiency, we're not discussing merely the technical architecture, but a moral architecture. We are making decisions about access, power, inclusion, stewardship, who's in, who's out, for what reasons, and whose interests that infrastructure ultimately serves. So as we move toward realizing the promise of digital public infrastructure at scale, we need equally serious an examination of the ethical assumptions underpinning this transformation. And this panel hopes to contribute to that discussion, turning that familiar claim that DPI is built for all into a question that we'll explore critically together. So when infrastructure becomes digital, how do we ensure that ethics become infrastructure? Our question is not merely, does DPI work? But what kinds of social relations, what obligations, and what futures it affords. So I'm excited to explore these questions together with three brilliant thinkers. Join me again in welcoming Caitlin, Alana, and Chinazo. I'm glad I didn't have to do that with a handheld. Nothing worse than standing with a handheld. So maybe just off the top, I'd love to give everyone a minute to introduce themselves, your organizational affiliation, maybe tell us how you're related to this field, to this work. Alana?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Alana Welch, and I am the Deputy Head of Public Sector Advisory with Access Partnership. Some of you might know who we are. Most of you probably don't. We're a relatively small boutique consulting firm focused on the intersection of technology and public policy. Previously, I was with USAID. I led the digital policy at USAID. And so I come to this particular topic because I led really the policy objectives of DPI and DPGs for the US government's foreign policy for a number of years. And the topic's very near and dear to my heart.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Augustine. I'm the Vice President of Product and Programs at DataKind. I would say, similar to Alana, we're a small organization. You might not know us. We're about 15 years old, a global nonprofit focused on using data and technology for social impact. And the way that we, as DataKind, come to this conversation around DPI is we are tool builders and we are access creators. And we work on top of the many data systems that institutions, organizations, governments build. And we want to support and to grow and to expand our knowledge as a field of what is contained within those data sets, data systems. How do we make them more equitable? How do we, in this world of AI, I know it's not an AI panel, but when we talk about AI readiness, it's not just the technical capability of the data to be utilized within analytical models. It's understanding what is represented within that data. It is understanding the intent of that data collection. And as DataKind, we are deeply embedded in that conversation, and we're a partner of many of you in the room and eager to keep building that capacity forward.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chinazo Anebelondo, and I am the Director of AI Solutions Delivery at Data Science Nigeria. At Data Science Nigeria, we have a mission to build 1 million AI talent. And what that means is that we empower young researchers, students in the African ecosystem with AI knowledge and infrastructure. And on the other hand, we build AI products that improve the lives of everyday people. And what this has exposed us to is working with governments, with development agencies, and building solutions that improve public service delivery, health systems, education at subnational levels. And based off of the lessons we've learned from, building all those solutions, seeing the gaps, we now have a startup called Equalize AI. And from the name Equalize, what we try to do is to build African data sets, African AI models that close some of the gaps we've seen, be it language exclusion or access exclusion. How do we build AI solutions that can reach the people in the most rural area and that can also speak their language? And for this conversation, I'll be sharing all the lessons we've learned from building, digital public infrastructure for government, the gaps we've seen, the exclusions, the inclusions, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe our first takeaway is that every panel is an AI panel these days, right? So there's going to be hints of that throughout. So we're going to do this in 4 rounds. We're going to talk about 4 dimensions of the ethics and principles underpinning the DPI paradigm, or the DPI shift. And the first, maybe to come straight at it in a way that's most connected to the introduction, the first is around inclusion and exclusion, how the logic and architecture even of digital public infrastructure can act to include or exclude certain groups, certain actors. And so I think, Chinazo, we'll start with you. The prompt here is DPI is designed to, or the claim is that DPI inherently expands access, but who specifically, or how specifically, might it, let's say, advance systemic exclusion? And what is the mechanism through which that happens?
Thank you. So what we've learned is that digital public infrastructure are not really neutral. The infrastructure is not neutral. It reflects the assumptions, the design assumptions that build that infrastructure. For example, when a DPI is built, it assumes mobile phone access, it assumes national identity. It assumes that as simple as or as easy as national identity is, some people still don't have it. If I use Nigeria, for example, we're about 220 to 250 million people, depending on your source, but we still have, say, 186 million people with national identity. Now imagine if you build a DPI on that assumption, because, and this applies to countries that do not issue national identity at birth. You grow up to a certain level and then you try to find it. And so these assumptions, whether it's mobile access, whether it's some level of digital literacy, whether it's connectivity, these design assumptions define the way the DPI is built. While it still expands access, we have a couple of examples. We have the India stack, which has used national identity and payment systems to expand access to people. We also have the popular M-Pesa here in Kenya. But those same metrics that expands that access also excludes people. And the typical example of people who are excluded are, say, people who are in the very remote areas, rural areas. They don't have even cellular signal access. We're not even talking about internet connection. We're talking about cellular connection here. And people who do not have even that level of digital literacy to use a DPI. And then if it's an AI-enabled DPI, you start looking at the minority languages who are not captured in the system if they want to select their language, but there's no option for that because there are no existing AI models that have their language included. And it becomes even risky when these DPIs have influence on access to, say, health or health prioritization, access to education, access to finances. And what makes it even worse is that some of these people do not know why they are being denied services. They do not understand, the reason, and there's no mechanism for them to ask or query why, so that at least they can provide feedback. And so we find this a system that, while it expands access, it also systematically excludes people. And it's not accidental, I'll say. It's the design choices. You want people to put their biometrics. What happens to manual workers who have their fingerprints worn out? What happens to people who live with disability? I have a friend who, when he wanted to get his international passport, because it requires biometrics capture, because he had this disability in his right hand, they needed to, it was a very long process for him to get the same international passport that everyone gets using the DPI that is available. But I think even in that case, he was accommodated, just that it's more frustrating, because then it becomes a very long process for him to get it. But then, but something like that is because for him, or for that process, it requires physical visitation. There are some assumptions that do not even require the citizen to be there, and they are just excluded. And they are there not knowing they are excluded. And so those are the conversation around the inclusion and exclusion of DPI. And it's a continuous conversation that needs to be had, especially in African context, where there's a lot of influence on digital public infrastructure. It's not rooted in the digital transformation vision of the people. It's mostly donor influenced. And so there's a timeline. There's, there's a limit to what can be done. So I'll just stop there, but I think those are some of the things that come up when we discuss inclusion and inclusion within DPI systems.
Chinazo, thank you. Caitlin, I wonder, we talked a little bit, was it just yesterday? I'm losing track of the days. We talked a little bit yesterday, 2 days ago, about specifically the expectation of connectivity that's built into DPI. I wonder if that or any other piece of Chinazo's remarks resonated with you.
Yes, I think, digital public infrastructure assumes, reliable connectivity. And when we think about connectivity, I right before this, pulled some stats from Dev Gateway. In terms of internet penetration, on the African continent, it's 36%. In Asia, it's 68%. US, it's 89%. So we have this huge set of our population that is disconnected from the internet. And when we think about building DPI, there's a question of who understands the value of it? What does it mean for those disconnected individuals? If there's an effort to get a national ID for someone in a rural community, how do you make it valuable to them? How do you explain that this is useful to them? How do they come in and co-create the process to say, this is how I can benefit from this? Another sort of tack I wanted to take in talking about who gets excluded from DPI is when we actually build the DPI. I work for a company that's headquartered out of the United States. We do a lot of data work in partnership with local actors. That's not uncommon. And so when we think of who is building the DPI, we have huge non-local teams building DPI. We are not building the skills training in the local capacity to actually stand up and sustain these infrastructure. And those are design choices, and they might be made for efficiency, they might be made for access, they might be made on cost perspectives, but a design choice to exclude your local economy from building the DPI is one of those key kind of points of exclusion.
Thanks. Alana, I just want to give you the chance to jump in if you want.
I was actually just going to say the same thing, which is that these are design choices, and they're very concrete choices as well. So the types of DPI that we build might be very technically interoperable, but still socially exclusionary. if we're not considering things like what documents people are required to produce and whether they have access to them, placing enrollment points far from remote communities so it's difficult to get to, the device and connectivity issue. So if you don't have devices that can connect, are you actually able to access these systems that you need to? Offering services only in dominant languages, particularly in countries where there are a lot of different national languages, and setting eligibility rules. Who do we count as citizens? Who do we count as people that are eligible for identity within a country? And all of these choices are made usually at the design phase. And so if we aren't thinking about inclusion from design, then we're never going to have an inclusive DPI system.
That tracks. Not to continue to revisit the metaphor, what we're talking about is a choice that we make about where the on-ramps and off-ramps are on the highways or the railways that we're building here, right? And imagine the highway with no entry point, the highway that just passes you by, the highway that is either by virtue of technical infrastructure, technical access, cellular connectivity, or physical access points, or a failure to include different ability when in the design phase, right? We can potentially put that access point, that entry point, impossibly far from the folks that are intended to benefit from the system. So thank you. I think with that, right, we'll move to our second round. DPI is powered by data, right? Data is what flows through digital public infrastructure, and we know that there are challenges associated with, correlated with data in large volumes, data, personally identifying data at the foundational level powering these systems. So that brings with it the question of algorithmic bias, that brings with it the question or the possibility of surveillance. And I wonder, Chinazo, if you want to start us on this path.
Thank you. Yes, data is a layer through which bias is introduced to DPI systems. And I think one other misconception that people have is they think because DPI is technical, then it's objective. It does not have emotion, so it treats everybody the same. But then the power is codified, the assumption is codified, the bias is codified. For the fact that it may look objective or seem technical, that it treats people the same. But within the code that was used to develop it and the data that it was built on lies in the bias. And you have instances where the data is inherently biased, either because historically it has always been like that, and that data is assumed to be neutral, or you're saying, oh, the system will learn from that history. But as it's learning from that history, it's also using it to bias against people. We can also look at it in this way. Say, for example, I want to, there's a DPI and I want to register, and it's asking me for proof of address, and I'm homeless, but it assumes I'm a citizen and I have an that can come up. I think one of the speakers that talked about humans being messy, there's no structured way to have a persona defined. People can come in different forms. I can be living with disability, be homeless at the same time, do not have access to internet. In fact, basically not satisfy any of the conditions to use a DPI. But it assumes that I must at least satisfy one. So those are the biases. And another, risk there is that there is no mechanism, there's no strong citizen mechanism where people can give feedback or even challenge the system or know why they were denied access. Because that way, things can begin to be uncovered, why they were denied access, why, so those people can be highlighted to be existing. And so the way I look at it is DPI should not be an infrastructure, it should be a system. A system where if I cannot access the DPI, there should be alternatives as well for me. So if I'm excluded due to some bias from the digital infrastructure, that's fine. I should also have maybe another physical alternative for me to access it. And we may think that people like that do not exist. I was also surprised when I found that, I think there was a project we were doing, and a conversation around national identification number came up. And it was like, we need to come up with a strategy to increase enrollment. I'm like, increase enrollment? Should that not be automatic? Should everybody not have national identification number? Why are we looking at strategy to increase enrollment? At the same time, there are lots of DPIs already in production, already being used, already influencing healthcare prioritization. So it was hard for me to reconcile that people are yet to have this national identity, even as at 2026, but then a lot of things are dependent on that already. To access a lot of government services, you need to provide it. And so essentially, it requires a system. When we talk about bias, to handle biases, we need a whole system and not just the infrastructure.
Chinazo, thanks.
I just want to add to that. So thinking about the data that we collect and have historically collected, how little representation is in that. So in the health field, for years, medication has been built on the information from men, right? Women were not included in clinical trials, until recent decades. We think about how household surveys happen to learn about local consumer spending, and they're often done by mobile phone, and there's a single mobile phone for a household, and you'll have your head of household doing that, and that's often a man. And so how do we actually start to find ways within our information collection and these pieces of infrastructure to start to incorporate all sort of representations, be it gender representation, be it career representation. I think many of us maybe had to fill out the ETA upon coming here, and you had to pick your job. Did anyone find nonprofit executive? Did anyone find nonprofit? Did anyone find, social impact, right? So the jobs that so many of us here represent were not ones that we could self-identify with upon entering the country. And so we had to pick an alternative. Now, I was lucky. I got to call myself an engineer, even though I haven't practiced in over 20 years. But it's a chance to say, like, what is then your best alternative? And then when we start to think of how we use this data, can we trust it? So if someone's looking at information that came in for this conference, they might see a bunch of us as engineers. Are we truly engineers? Does that represent the work that we are doing and the ecosystem that we are building? It doesn't, and that is because the way that the infrastructure and the data standard under it was designed to exclude these pieces of information.
So I also noted that part of your question was around surveillance concerns, and I would be remiss if we did not discuss that, because I know that that's a chief concern within populations as we are moving towards DPI, particularly in countries where there might not be as much trust with the government, and trust is going to be such an essential factor when it comes to enrollment in DPI. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter if you have these systems in place if people aren't ever going to use them. And so the concern around surveillance has to be something that is addressed directly. And even though DPI is created for service delivery, the type of data that is being collected can very easily then transition into being used for surveillance. So identity checks, payment records, health data, CRVS, transaction trails, all of that has been joined up to create services that are more efficient for the citizen, and yet they can also create a very clear picture of a person's life and make them a target. And so purpose limitation, retention limits, access controls, audit logs, independent oversight, regulations at a national level, possibly international monitoring, and then clear rules on data sharing. All of these things have to be considered. I don't think we're having enough conversations about that. So much of the time when we talk about DPI, we're either talking about the actual technology stack or we're talking about the policy more broadly about how can we bring people into into these systems, and we're not talking about what are the concerns that would be underlying particularly vulnerable groups that would then form a barrier to them joining and then limiting inclusion over the long term. So just, something to take away as we are having these conversations moving forward to be thinking about as well.
I'd love to add to that to think of, accountability within DPI. Part of thinking about DPI systems, they are open source, they're often decentralized, they tend to have an altruistic sheen on them, even if they perhaps aren't. But when DPI fails, who is accountable, right? In the COVID era, we saw the incredible limits of the infrastructure to get unemployment dollars out to individuals. And there wasn't an accountability mechanism. No one went to jail. No one got extra compensation by the time they eventually got. So I'm curious to my fellow panelists, thinking of how does accountability get built into DPI, and maybe as practitioners, what should we be doing?
So I think for accountability, multiple stakeholders have to be involved. The civil society, legislative overview. We need to have even public opinion. We need to have. We need to ensure that representation is robust, and then governance framework is properly defined, and we identify who is responsible for what. And I say this because for some of these deployments, they are deployed at large scale before safety measures are even put in place. And that's because it's influenced by donor funding. There's a timeline. It's like imposed on the government to build this DPI. And they don't have enough time to define this framework that will guide the sustainability, data ownership, procurement, who will be accountable for that. And in our experience, we've had situations like that because there's a donor fund, there's a timeline, and we thought we would have that sustainability plan and governance framework in place. But even as at the time of completion of the DPI and deployment, there were still questions about where are we going to host the solution, who will be responsible for updating it. A lot of things were still hanging. Should we put it in this ministry or in that ministry? Oh, they don't have data center here. We need to make sure that the data, is private. And those are the issues when governance framework is not properly defined and safety measures are not put in place ahead of the deployment so that you can hold someone accountable. You can say, this person, when you define those things, you can know who is responsible for what. And when the system fails, it can easily be traced and fixed before it gets out of hand.
And we're talking about that in a system or a paradigm that is by design incredibly complex, interconnected. Accountability is dispersed across ministry verticals and beyond ministries and so on and so forth. So it makes that question all the harder to answer. And that actually transitions us very well into round 3. And we didn't even plan that in that way. That worked out very nicely, which is about governance gaps and democratic accountability. So DPI systems in many instances are being deployed, exactly as you said, Chinazo, prior to the legal frameworks or the public deliberation or even the fora for public deliberation before they can catch up. Right? These are not necessarily new technologies, but we're combining them in radically new ways. So what concerns do we have about accountability frameworks, about governance frameworks, particularly accountability to citizens? What concerns do we have, and are we seeing this being handled well anywhere else? Please feel free to start with any part of that sprawling question. Ilana, can I go to you first?
Sure. I mean, I was really actually glad Chinazzo made that that point because our implementation of these systems are outpacing our governance layers. And once a system becomes embedded, it's very difficult to unwind, particularly failures in that system or difficulties. Coming from the US, we have long legacy systems, and instead of actually like fixing the technology stacks, we just kind of build on top of it, which now it makes them even more cumbersome and awful, frankly. And so, short-term decisions being made on the timelines of donors or trying to like meet this moment, quote unquote, without thinking about long-term governance design. So we're making these short-term decisions about architecture and vendors and data standards and interoperability where it exists. They then become the long-term governance because we, by necessity, now have to adhere to what we put in place. And I see very few examples where this is being thought about well. Oftentimes, this is going to have to come from a legislative agenda and not just a policy reform. And so, regulations take a long time. It takes a lot of buy-in and political will, particularly in more democratic countries. And I think it's really incumbent on civil society in particular to be pushing politicians for those reforms in order to make sure that we are putting those governance standards in place, but also it's up to us, the people in this room, to make sure that when we are in conversation about this with the governments that we are working with, that we are raising that as a legitimate issue and centering citizens at the heart of it. I've been talking for a long time, so I'm gonna pass on.
I also want to jump in around the idea of technical literacy among our governments, right? I think the builders of the infrastructure, the builders of the technology are the ones also doing the education of the power of that technology, right? And that's been a reoccurring theme in a number of sessions I've been in of, we have relatively few incumbent, meaningfully large tech providers, and they are the ones educating us on the safety of these tools and the opportunities of these tools. And it is not necessarily that it's untrue, but it is the dominant or sometimes the exclusive perspective. So how does a citizenry gain the information that would allow them to question? How does a government make it incumbent upon the decision makers to truly understand what it means, right? And I come from a U.S. perspective. Our government, I would say probably less than half of them have ever tried to use a generative AI tool, right? And yet they are writing incredibly consequential policy that will have ramifications from the U.S. and beyond. So I think we need to think of how do we truly make the case and how what are those assessment mechanisms for understanding why we would adopt.
Yeah, so I think still speaking on governance gaps, I'll leave this to everyone to ponder because we're not custodians of ethics in DPI. And someone asked me a question, I think on the first day, about voluntary participation for citizens. You're a regular citizen going about your day-to-day lives, and suddenly there's this option, there's this barrier to accessing what you normally would access. Where does that leave you a choice to say, I want to participate or not? Because your essential services are reliant on that. You have to do this for you to get the services, public services that you have been having initially. And so I wonder where that voluntary participation comes in. Can you decide to opt out? How do you opt out from a digital public infrastructure? Are you going to create your own state and live alone? So, those are the thoughts. And when the person, I can't remember who did, and I was wondering, how do you make those decisions? And how does the governance framework accommodate things like that? Say you want to opt out, or it's like when new versions of products are rolled out, you can choose to remain in the default version and not move on with others, because the default version, which is usually manual, still at least accounts for you. You still access your services. Instead of being excluded, can I just stay back to my, default position. So that's also something that, we can all ponder on.
I'd like to maybe ask a kind of a follow-up on that, to think about who gets to make decisions about the data, right? When data is well collected in these DPI environments, right? Health data in Kenya, for example, was sold, right? Who can make the decision of where data flows and how it is used, and maybe who should be making those decisions?
And perhaps whether or not that decision is a binary decision at the outset, right? I agree to X, but does that mean that I have also agreed to Y and Z, which is inherent in the architecture of digital public infrastructure, again, because these systems are sharing data between themselves. I think we'll leave that one as a provocation for us, for you all. I want to take this will be your second book plug of the day. This conversation brings up a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Dan McQuillan. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Resisting AI. And as we said, every panel is a little bit about AI. But I think some of the lessons or some of his proposals in that book are relevant to this conversation. He asked the question whether or not even our existing forms of the models that we have for governance and accountability can function when we're talking about something as unprecedented and sprawling, tentacular as is digital public infrastructure, as is AI. So if you want a challenging but really interesting read, because Dan is a brilliant guy and uses words that I struggle to understand, I still recommend the book. It's called Resisting AI. I think this also helps us move into our last round, which is we start to mention, we talked about, and Caitlin, you talked about, this very same actors that are building some of the technologies that are powering these systems are the ones who are teaching us about the safeguards and their security, and they're teaching our policymakers the same thing. So there is an undeniable kind of political economy question underpinning DPI. And at the same time, also, we're seeing different models, different ways of answering those questions emerge from different parts of the world. There's India Stack, there's X-Road, right? There are many different alternatives appearing. So I wonder, and maybe Ilana, this is a good question to start with you. Tell us about the geopolitics, or at the very least, the political economy underpinning, or maybe the economy also underpinning DPI.
Yeah, I mean, from a political economy perspective, I mean, I think that we all are very familiar with this idea of digital sovereignty. It's been coming up a lot, and I'm glad there's finally like a name for it. I'm glad politicians are thinking about it. From my perspective, I've been hearing this raised since 2016. I was working on the Ebola response in West Africa, and then it was around cloud, and there was so much concern coming out from the government as we were looking at digitizing these very antiquated health systems, but the data then was going to live in a cloud server that was based in Europe, and there was a lot of concern about, okay, who now has access to that data? And so now around DPI, particularly as a lot of the systems being adopted are coming from developers outside of the countries in which they're going to be deployed, there is that concern. And so I would approach that by asking what kind of sovereignty a DPI system can give governments in practice. So sovereignty is not only about whether a platform is nationally branded or created within a country, but really I think in how it's implemented and used, and then where that system can be adapted to suit the needs of citizens, how data is managed and who has access to it. And so sovereignty, I think, is a much more nuanced question than just who builds it versus who uses it. And so for me, a genuinely sovereign DPI approach can still involve international partners and the private sector providers, and imported technology where it is an appropriate fit for the context, because it's always needs to be context driven. Many governments are not going to build every layer from scratch. I don't actually think that's efficient. I don't think that that's realistic. And so the key is whether the governments retain strategic control, and that's where the sovereignty lies, over the standards that they create, the data governance that's in place, procurement choices, the interoperability that we are setting up, the safeguards, which are so key, and the skills transfer within a country. How are we doing the capacity building? And that, for me, is like really where the sovereignty discussion can be quite powerful. Pass it on.
So I think when talking about the geopolitical economy in terms of DPIs and sovereignty, when you look at the public-private collaboration or partnership, the government is mostly reliant on the private for everything, for cloud infrastructure, for cybersecurity, for even the capacity to build it. And then you begin to wonder, how do you create sovereignty in that kind of setting where everything is, the structure is external? But I think if the government has the vision, which I believe also contributes to some of the issues where the vision is imposed upon them, I think you should be doing DPI. It's already a global conversation, and it's not tied to actual socioeconomic needs of the country. So I think if the government has the vision and has clear understanding of the system, because for a lot of them, they don't even understand how things work. When you say AI or when you say DPI, it's all over the place for them. And I've had instances where we are pitching a credentialing system to a national body to be able to credential the health workers. We had series and series of meetings, and when we come again, they're like, one of them was like, the last time you guys came, I didn't really understand what you were talking about. So having that understanding of what the transformation will achieve will help them decide what part of this value chain can they make sovereign. Is it the data? If it's the cloud infrastructure, how can they protect their data? So that understanding is very important. Another aspect that I also want to touch on is it must not be at national level. It can be at subnational. And especially for, if you look at African context where it's diversified. There's multiple languages, multiple ethnicity. And if you look at a country like Nigeria, we have 36 states. And almost all the states have distinct language, distinct cultural disposition, religious disposition. So it's almost like they are unique in their own way. So if we look at sovereignty at that level, where the subnational government carries that vision, and they're able to manage the system better. And interestingly, some of them have what it takes because it requires, smaller capacity, smaller infrastructure when you're looking at a state rather than when you're looking at national level. So I think to have that sovereignty, we can look at subnational level, although having an overall linkage as a nation. But that will also help manage the whole conversation around sovereignty because it's at manageable levels, so to say.
Caitlin, do you want to take a final remark?
Yeah, I would say adding to the manageable levels, there's a quote I love that, if you put digital on top of a broken thing, you have a broken digital thing, right? When we think about some of the success in DPI, it's taking the smallest step forward on top of your existing systems. So I think some of the challenge I would put to us as we think about this political economy where we are spending is, what is the underlying architecture that we can fix before we add that digital item on top of it?
That's brilliant, thank you. Just to say that I really appreciate the remark about maybe the technology itself, maybe the platform itself doesn't necessarily need to be built locally, right? And I'm going to abuse this metaphor one last time, but maybe it doesn't matter quite so much if the rail itself is manufactured in country or if the train is manufactured in country, but it seems to matter in this conversation tremendously whether or not the decisions as to where those rails lead, who gets on, who gets off, how much they cost, so on and so forth. That is maybe the more salient question about sovereignty. So we are at the end of time. We did have a final round of questions, which is what is the advice that you would give to folks in the room? But instead, I'm going to ask you to approach your panelists and ask them to tell you what they think. Please join me again in thanking Chinazo, Caitlin, and Ilana. Thanks, everyone.